have to tell you something. I have to tell you what happened that day because I cannot keep it inside anymore. I have been a Muslim imam for 28 years. I have led thousands of prayers. I have read the Quran from beginning to end more times than I can count. I have taught children how to pray since I was a young man myself. I know what a normal prayer session looks like. I know what children sound like when they are being children, when they are distracted, when they are whispering to each other instead of focusing. I know all of that. I have seen all of that. But what happened on that Tuesday afternoon in our mosque in Doha, 4 years ago now, I have never seen anything like it in my entire life. Not once, not even close. And I am not a man who says things like that easily. I am a careful man. I am a man who thinks before he speaks. My own father raised me to never open my mouth about something unless I was certain of what I had seen with my own eyes. He used to say, "Yunus, do not speak of what your eyes did not witness." And so I am telling you now, I saw this. I was there. I was standing at the front of the room when it happened, and everything I am about to tell you is exactly what I witnessed. It was a Tuesday, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We had a children's prayer group that met every Tuesday at that time, something we had started nearly 3 years earlier. The idea was simple. We would bring children between the ages of 7 and 10 into the mosque, and we would teach them how to pray properly. We would teach them the words, the positions, the meaning behind everything they were doing. Most of their parents worked long hours, and they would drop the children off in the afternoon and collect them a couple of hours later. We had 20 children with us that day. Some of them I had known since they were infants, carried in on their mother's hips. Some were newer to the group, but all of them were between 7 and 10 years old, little ones, with small hands and small voices, and sneakers that squeaked against the tile when they walked. I remember the weather that day. It was hot outside, the way Doha is always hot in that season, but the mosque was cool from the air conditioning. The light through the windows was soft and golden, the particular light that comes only late in the afternoon. Everything felt quiet and unremarkable. I had no reason to think that Tuesday would be any different from any other Tuesday we had spent with those children. We began the session the way we always began it. I gathered the children and had them sit in rows on the prayer mats. I reminded them to be still, to settle their hearts before we started. A few of them were restless, as children always are at first. A boy named Zaid, 8 years old, kept twisting around to make his friend laugh. A girl named Hana, 9, was fussing with the edge of her headscarf, not yet paying attention. These were ordinary things, exactly what I expected. I led them through the opening recitation slowly, the way I always did, making sure they could follow along. We moved through the first part of the prayer together. I could hear their small voices joining mine, some strong and confident, others still learning, softer. After the recitation, I told them to remain on their mats and spend a little time in quiet, personal prayer. I told them to close their eyes and speak to God from their hearts, not the formal words, not the recitation, just their own words, whatever they wished to say. I told them to be honest and open. I told them that God hears even the quietest prayer. And that is when everything changed. I bowed my own head to pray. I closed my eyes. The room went very quiet, only the soft hum of the air conditioning and the far-off sound of traffic outside. I began praying for the children, asking that their hearts stay open, that they would grow into people of faith and goodness. I was still in my own prayer when the first sound reached me. It was a sound I had never heard before, not in 28 years, not anywhere. It began with one child. I did not open my eyes right away. At first I assumed a child was crying softly, which happens sometimes, especially with the younger ones who are carrying something heavy in their small hearts. But this was not exactly crying. It was more like a sound coming from somewhere deep inside the child, from very far within. It was raw and small and completely unrehearsed. It was real in a way that made the hair on my arms rise before I understood why. Then a second child made a sound, then a third. I opened my eyes. What I saw when I opened my eyes is something I will never be able to fully explain in words. I will try, I will do my best, but I want you to know, before I even begin, that every word I choose will fall short of what I actually witnessed in that room. The children were still on their mats. None of them had moved from their positions, but their faces, Their faces were completely unlike any faces I had ever seen on any child at any time. Their eyes were closed. Their heads were tilted slightly upward, as though they were looking at something above them, even with their eyes shut. And on every single face, on all 20 of those children, there was an expression I can only describe as seeing something, not imagining, not pretending, but actually seeing something directly in front of them. The expressions were different from child to child, and that is what struck me hardest. If they had been pretending, playing some game, copying one another, their faces would have looked similar. They did not look similar at all. Some children had tears streaming silently down their cheeks, no sound at all, just tears falling. Some had their mouths slightly parted, as though they wanted to speak but were too overcome. One boy, Rayan, 10 years old, usually the most restless and easily distracted child in the whole group, had both hands pressed flat against his chest. His entire body was still. His face held a peace I had never once seen on him, the kind of peace that normally takes decades to find, if it is found at all. Then the sounds began to grow. They were not speaking Arabic. They were not speaking anything I recognized. The sounds coming from these children were languages I had never heard in my life. Not English, not Urdu, not Tagalog, not Malayalam, not any of the many languages I had heard over 28 years leading a mosque in a city full of people from every corner of the world. These were none of those. The sounds were fluid, almost musical, carrying a rhythm as if each child were actually saying something specific and important, just not in any language any of us in that room had ever learned. I stood completely still. I want to be honest about that. My body simply would not move, not from fear exactly, though I did not yet understand what was happening. It was more as if my body understood. Before my mind could catch up, that the only correct response was complete stillness. I looked around the room. 2 other men had been helping with the children's program that day, Brother Hamza and Brother Salim. I looked at them, and they were exactly as frozen as I was, standing with their eyes wide, staring at the children the way I was staring. None of us spoke. None of us moved. The children were praying. That is the only word I have for it. They were praying in languages none of us could understand, and as they prayed, the sound continued to build. It was not loud in the way a crowd is loud. It was more like music that gathers slowly, each voice joining the one before it, until together they became something larger than any single voice could ever be. The voices of those 20 children, all between 7 and 10 years old, all praying in languages none of us knew, filled that room in a way I have no natural explanation for. I felt something on my skin, warmth, not the warmth of the sun, not the warmth of a heater. This was different. It began on my arms and rose up through my chest and into my face. It was the kind of warmth that feels like being held, the way it feels when someone who loves you rests their hands on your shoulders and you feel their warmth even through the fabric of your clothes. That is the closest comparison I can offer. Then the girl, Hana, the 9-year-old who had been fussing with her headscarf at the start, opened her eyes. And when she opened them, they were full of tears, and she looked directly toward a spot in the center of the room. She was not looking at me. She was not looking at any of the other children. She was looking at something in the middle of the room that none of the rest of us could see. And she said something. She said it in Arabic, which is why I understood it. In a voice so quiet I had to strain to catch it, she said, "You came." Just those 2 words, "You came." Then she closed her eyes again and returned to the language she had been praying in before, the language none of us recognized. My knees went weak when she said that. I'm a large man. I'm not someone whose knees go weak. But in that moment, my legs felt as though they might not hold me. Because of the way she said it, the tone, the look on her face, I understood that she was not speaking to an idea. She was not addressing a concept or a memory or something she had merely read about. She was speaking to someone standing right there in that room, someone she could see clearly. I did not know, in that moment, who she was seeing. My mind searched frantically through everything I had ever learned, everything I had ever taught. Nothing had prepared me for what was happening in that room. The children continued. For how long, I honestly cannot say with certainty. My sense of time had left me entirely. Looking back now, it feels as though it could have lasted 20 minutes or 2 hours. Brother Hamza told me afterward that it was closer to 40 minutes, from the moment the first child made that first sound until the last child slowly opened their eyes. 40 minutes of those children praying in tongues they had never learned, weeping without sorrow, their faces carrying something I had no word for. Some of them began to move during that time, not wildly, not in any uncontrolled way. Some raised their hands slowly, the way you might reach up to touch something just above your head. Small hands, 7-year-old hands, 8-year-old hands, reaching upward towards something none of us could see. One small boy, Idris, only 7 and the youngest child in the group, stood up from his mat without opening his eyes. He rose slowly and carefully, and he stretched both arms out in front of him, the way a child reaches for a parent across a crowded room. And his face, as he stood there with his arms extended, was the face of a child who has found exactly what he had been looking for, the most complete relief I have ever witnessed on a human face. I watched all of this without making a sound. Brother Hamza and Brother Salim watched without a sound. I think, without saying it aloud to one another, we all understood that whatever was happening in that room, we had no right to interrupt it. We had neither the understanding nor the authority to decide when it should end. We simply watched. The moment that broke me completely, the moment I could no longer hold myself together, came when a 10-year-old girl named Maryam began to speak. She had been praying in tongues along with the others. But then the unfamiliar language slowed, and she began to cry, real crying this time, the kind where the shoulders shake and the breath comes in short, broken bursts. And through her crying, in Arabic, she began to speak. She said, I did not know who you were, I am sorry, I am so sorry. She repeated it, I did not know who you were. That broke me, it broke me completely, because in all my years leading prayer, I had never once heard a child apologize to someone standing directly in front of her. Children apologize to their parents. They apologize to teachers, to friends. They do not apologize to concepts. They do not apologize to ideas. Maryam was apologizing the way you apologize to a real person, to someone right there, looking at you, someone who by every right could be upset with you, but who you could somehow tell was not upset at all. That is exactly how she sounded. I realized then that I was crying myself. I had not noticed the tears begin. I am a 61-year-old man. I have buried my own parents. I have sat beside the dying. I have carried heavy things in my life without breaking down. I am not a man who cries easily. But I stood at the front of that room, watching children who could not possibly have arranged this, who could not have rehearsed or planned or coordinated it among themselves, and I was crying like a child myself. One by one, after some time, the children began to return. Their eyes opened. The sounds quieted. The room began to settle. And as each child came back to full awareness, the expression on their face shifted, not to sadness, not to confusion, but to a particular kind of quiet. The quiet a person carries after receiving news that has changed everything. Zaid, the 8-year-old who had spent the beginning of the session trying to make his friend laugh, was one of the last to open his eyes. When he did, he looked around the room slowly, as though trying to remember where he was. Then he looked at me. He said in his small 8-year-old voice, Imam Yunus, did you see him? I could not answer right away. I tried to speak and nothing came out. I cleared my throat and tried again. Who did you see, Zaid? He thought about it for a moment, the way children think when they want to get the words exactly right. Then he said, the man with the light. He had light coming out of his hands and his face. He knew my name. He said my name, and it made my whole chest feel warm. I asked him, did he tell you who he was? Zaid nodded. He said his name, but I already knew when I looked at his face. He said the name. It was Issa, the Arabic name for the one Christians call Jesus. I felt the ground shift beneath me the way you feel it when you take a step, and the surface is not where you expected. Everything moved, not physically, but somewhere deep in my mind and heart. 28 years as an imam. 28 years leading a mosque, teaching the Quran, building an entire life on one understanding of who God is and how he speaks. And now this 8-year-old boy, who 5 minutes earlier had been trying to make his friend laugh, was telling me that Issa had entered the room and spoken his name. I asked the other children then to share what they had experienced if they wished. I must have looked unsteady, because Brother Salim came and stood close beside me, as if ready to hold me up if I needed it. Child after child began to speak. Some were still wiping tears from their faces. Some held hands with the child beside them, and they all described the same thing, but in different ways, with different details, the way genuine witnesses to a real event always do. They described a man made of light, standing in the center of the room. They said the light was warm, and it did not hurt their eyes, even though it was very bright. They said the man looked at each of them individually, that even with 20 children in the room, every single one felt as though they were the only one he was looking at. Some gave specific details. One boy said the man had marks on his hands, marks that went all the way through, and that the light shone most brightly from those places. A girl said he smiled at her, and when he smiled, she felt as though someone had lifted a heavy weight off her back, a weight she had not even known she was carrying. A younger boy said that when the man spoke, the sound did not come from outside him. It came from inside, as though the words were already sitting in his chest before he ever heard them with his ears. Hannah, the 9-year-old who had said, "You came," told me she had prayed the week before, alone at home at night, a prayer she had told no one about. She said she had asked God to show her if there was more to know. That is exactly what she said. A 9-year-old girl, alone in her room at night, asking God if there was more to know. And the following Tuesday, in the mosque during children's prayer, this happened. I am still turning that detail over in my mind. A 9-year-old child asked God a genuine question and received an answer the following week. Her simple prayer, her honest and open question, was heard and answered. I have been a man of prayer for nearly 3 decades, and that single detail, a child's quiet, private prayer being answered so directly, moved me more than nearly anything else about that entire day. The children began speaking again in the unknown languages for a short while after they shared what they had witnessed, but softer this time, the way sound settles at the end of something rather than in its middle. And then it stopped completely. The room returned to full quiet. The air conditioning hummed. Outside, a car passed. The afternoon light was still gold through the windows. I sat down on the floor. I know that might sound unusual for an imam to simply sit down in the middle of a session, but my legs finally insisted, and I had nothing left to argue with them. I sat and looked at these children looking back at me with their quiet, changed faces. I thought about everything I had been taught and everything I had spent my life teaching others. I thought about those 20 children and the languages that had come from their mouths, languages I was certain none of them had ever studied or even heard before. I thought about Zaid saying, "Issa." I thought about Maryam saying, "I did not know who you were." I thought about Idris, 7 years old, standing with his arms outstretched like a child reaching for a parent across a room. I did not have answers. I want to be honest about that. I did not walk out of that mosque with everything resolved. I did not have a tidy explanation or a clear map of what to do next. I was shaken in a way I had never been shaken before. Everything I believed I understood sat differently inside me now, like furniture that had been quietly rearranged in a familiar house. Everything was still there, but nothing was where I had left it. That evening, after the parents had come and collected their children, after Brother Hamza and Brother Salim had both gone home looking as quiet and altered as I felt, I sat alone in the empty mosque for a long time. The lights were low. The room was still. The prayer mats remained on the floor where the children had been sitting. And I prayed. I prayed the way I had not prayed since I was a young man first learning what prayer even was. I prayed without any formula, without any structure. I simply talked. I spoke to God and told him everything I was feeling. I told him I was confused. I told him I was afraid. I told him I had given 28 years to this, and I needed him to help me understand what had happened in that room. I told him I wanted to know the truth, whatever the truth was, even if it turned out to be different from everything I had believed until then. I told him I wanted to know it the way Hannah had asked to know it the week before. I asked God, plainly, if there was more to know. Something happened while I prayed alone in that room that I will only describe in part, because it belongs to me in a private way. I will say only this: I was not alone in that room when I prayed. I know that with certainty. I felt the same warmth I had felt while the children were praying, the warmth that moves up through the chest. And in my heart, not with my ears, I heard a name. my name, my full name, spoken with more love and more gentleness than I have words to describe. And I understood, in that moment, what the children had understood. I understood what Zaid had been trying to describe when he said the man knew his name, and it made his whole chest feel warm. I have not shared this story publicly until now. For a long time, I kept it only between myself and the two brothers who were with me that day. We were afraid of what people would say, afraid of what it would mean for our lives, for our families, for our place in our community. I will not pretend that fear is entirely gone even now, but I am more afraid of staying silent than I am of speaking, because those 20 children experienced something real. Hannah's simple prayer was answered. Maryam's apology was received. Idris's small arms found something to reach for. And Zaid, my restless little 8-year-old, who could never sit still for a full recitation, sat completely still for 40 minutes, while light moved through the hands of someone who knew his name. In the 4 years since that Tuesday, I have watched those children grow, quietly, in ways only a handful of us understand. I have watched Hannah, now a serious and thoughtful teenager, still carrying that same quiet certainty in her eyes whenever the subject comes up between us, which is rare and always careful, always in private. I have watched Zaid, who is no longer the boy who could not sit still, grow into someone unusually attentive for his age, someone who listens the way people listen when they have learned that important things are sometimes said quietly. I have watched Maryam carry what happened to her like something folded carefully and kept close, brought out only with people she trusts completely. I do not know exactly what has happened in each of those 20 households since that day. Some parents, I believe, know a version of what occurred, enough to be watchful, enough to be quiet about it themselves. Others, I suspect, know nothing at all, and their children have learned, the way children learn things far too young sometimes, to keep certain things folded up inside themselves. I think of Brother Hamza and Brother Salim often. The three of us do not speak of that day nearly as much as you might expect. There is a kind of unspoken agreement among us. We do not need to keep repeating it to each other to know that we all still carry it. When we do speak of it, usually late at night, usually only the three of us, our voices go quiet in a particular way, the way voices go quiet around something too large to say loudly. I continue to lead prayers. I continue outwardly to do the work I have always done, but something underneath all of it has shifted permanently. I find myself praying differently now, less certain of the boundaries I once assumed existed, more willing to simply sit in silence and listen rather than fill every moment with the words I was trained to say. I find myself, more than I would have expected at 61, still asking the same question I asked alone in that mosque that evening. I want to know the truth, whatever it is. I am still walking through that question, slowly, carefully, honestly. I do not have it resolved. I am not certain I ever will, not fully, not in the way I once believed certainty was possible. But I am walking, I am asking, I am open in a way I was not open before that Tuesday afternoon, and I have come to believe that openness itself is exactly where this walk begins, not the end of the search, but its beginning. I have been asked, by the few people I have quietly confided in over these 4 years, what I now believe. It is not a simple question to answer, and I will not pretend to have a tidy statement of faith to offer in place of the honest uncertainty I still carry. What I can say is this: I no longer believe the boundaries I once drew around who God is and how He chooses to reveal Himself were as solid as I had assumed. I no longer believe that 28 years or 2,800 years of careful study automatically closes every door to something new arriving, something that does not fit neatly inside what has already been written down and settled. I think often about the difference between what I was taught to expect from prayer and what I actually witnessed in that room. I had spent decades teaching children the correct positions, the correct words, the correct order of things, and all of that has value. I still believe that. But what happened that Tuesday did not follow any order I had ever taught. It arrived on its own terms, in its own time, to children who were not looking for it, who were, if anything, distracted and restless just moments before. It arrived to a 9-year-old who had asked a private, honest question the week before. It arrived to a boy who could not sit still. It arrived to me, a man who had built his entire identity around already knowing the answers. I believe that the light those children saw was real. I believe the man in the room was real. I believe the marks on his hands meant something the children could not have invented, something none of them had the theological training to construct on their own. 20 children, aged 7 to 10, do not conspire together to invent a consistent, detailed vision of a wounded man radiating light, who knows each of them individually by name. I have turned that fact over in my mind more times than I can count, searching for another explanation, and I have never found one that fits as simply and as completely as the one the children themselves gave me, without hesitation, without coordination, each in their own words. I believe that Hannah's prayer was heard. I believe that Maryam's apology was received exactly the way it sounded, as an apology offered to someone present, someone with every right to hold it against her, who instead met her with something she described afterward, once she had calmed enough to describe it, as the opposite of anger. I believe that Idris's small, outstretched arms found what they were reaching for. I believe that Zaid's warm chest and the names spoken into it were real. And I believe that when I sat alone in that mosque that evening and asked, honestly, whether there was more to know, I received an answer of my own, quiet, private, and entirely undeniable to me, whatever anyone else chooses to make of it. I am telling this story now, 4 years later, because I believe silence has a cost, and I have paid enough of it already. I know how this will sound to many who read it. I know some will say I am fabricating this, or that grief or age or exhaustion has confused me. I understand why someone might think that. 4 years ago, if another imam had told me this same story, I likely would have thought something similar myself. But I ask you to consider this. I have nothing to gain by telling you this. I still lead prayers. I still hold my position, carefully, quietly, saying nothing publicly of what happened until this moment. Speaking now puts all of that at risk, and I am aware of exactly what that risk means in the place where I live. I am not asking for anything from you. I am not building a following or seeking any kind of platform. I am an old man who watched 20 children experience something in one ordinary Tuesday afternoon that I cannot explain by any means available to me. And I have decided, after 4 years of careful, private consideration, that carrying it alone any longer is a heavier burden than whatever comes from finally setting it down in front of other people. If you have children of your own, I would only ask you to remember this. Children do not need to be taught what is real. They recognize it, often faster and more clearly than we do. Precisely because they have not yet built up decades of certainty about what is and is not possible. 20 children, in a quiet mosque, in Doha showed me something on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that 28 years of my own careful study had never shown me. I do not know entirely what to do with that, but I know I cannot pretend any longer that it did not happen. My name is Yunus Abdul Karim. I have been an imam for 28 years. On a Tuesday afternoon 4 years ago in a mosque in Doha, I watched 20 children encounter something I still do not have adequate words for, and I have not been the same since. This is my account of what I witnessed, exactly as I witnessed it, and I offer it to you honestly, without embellishment, because I believe, after 4 years of turning it over quietly in my heart, that it deserves to be told.